There are some cases that do not begin with a crime. No theft, no violence, no danger at all, only something that should not have happened. On a quiet evening, a gentleman returned home to find that nothing had been taken, and yet something had changed. The door was still locked, the windows untouched, but the clock, which he had left unwound, was quietly ticking. It was an evening that asked for very little. I found myself holding my breath. Holmes remained perfectly still. Several seconds passed. Then came the softest of knocks at the door below. Gas lamps glowed behind their glass casings like distant embers, and the sounds of the city arrived muted and unhurried. Hudson's footsteps approached the door, unhurried as ever. The murmur of voices followed, indistinct but polite, a pause. Then her familiar tread upon the stairs. Shadows rested easily along the walls, untroubled by movement. I had drawn the curtains shortly after dusk, and the familiar smell of coal smoke and polished wood filled the room with the quiet assurance of routine. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair near the hearth, his long frame at ease, his fingers loosely intertwined. His eyes were open, yet unfocused, as though they rested not upon the room before him, but upon some distant interior landscape known only to himself. It was a stillness I had learned not to disturb. On the small table beside him lay his violin, untouched for the moment, its polished surface catching a faint glimmer of firelight. The bow rested carefully across the strings, placed there with the unconscious precision that marked all his habits. I took my seat opposite him, with a book I had already read more than once. It served its purpose nonetheless. There are evenings when reading is less about discovery than companionship, and the simple presence of print upon a page can be comfort enough. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels softened by fog and distance. Somewhere farther off, a door closed. The city was settling into itself, each sound folding gently into the next. Holmes shifted slightly in his chair. "The quality of silence," he said at last, "changes with the hour." I looked up from my book. "In what way?" I asked. "In the early evening," he replied, his voice low and unhurried. "Silence is expectant. It waits. Later, it becomes permissive. It allows things to rest." I smiled faintly. "And what does it allow tonight?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. His gaze had drifted toward the window, though the curtains concealed all but the suggestion of the world beyond. "Reflection," he said at last, "and perhaps remembrance." The fire shifted, sending a brief cascade of sparks upward before settling again. Holmes's face, illuminated for a moment, bore no sign of strain or intensity. There was, instead, a rare softness in his expression, not sadness, but something nearer to contemplation. "You have not touched your violin," I observed. "No," he agreed. Music would fill the room too completely. I closed my book and set it aside. "It is a quiet night," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and quiet nights often precede small truths." The clock upon the mantel marked the passing minutes with a steady, restrained cadence. Its ticking was neither intrusive nor urgent, but reassuring, a gentle acknowledgment of time continuing in its orderly fashion. It struck me then how rarely we spoke of such evenings. Our shared history, as recorded in my notes and recollections, leaned heavily upon moments of urgency, sudden visits, breathless revelations, pursuits through darkened streets. Yet there were far more nights like this one, nights in which nothing demanded attention, and therefore everything could be observed. Holmes leaned forward slightly and adjusted the log upon the fire, careful to disturb the embers as little as possible. "You know, Watson," he said, There are mysteries that arrive unannounced and announce themselves loudly. We have made our living upon such cases. Indeed, I replied. And then there are others, he continued, that drift in quietly. They take no shape at first. They announce nothing. They merely wait to be noticed. I considered this. And how are such mysteries discovered? I asked. Holmes settled back once more, by those who are willing to sit still long enough to feel their presence. The room returned to silence, though it felt altered now, as though the conversation had tuned it to a slightly different pitch. I found myself listening not for interruption, but for continuity, the steady breathing of the house itself. Mrs. Hudson moved quietly somewhere below us, her footsteps familiar and unhurried. The sound carried with it the comfort of long acquaintance, of routines repeated so often they no longer required thought. Holmes's gaze returned to the violin, though he made no move toward it. "Do you recall," he asked, "the nights we spent waiting during the affair of the copper beeches?" "Very clearly," I said. "The waiting did not feel restful at the time." "Precisely," he replied. "Waiting is only peaceful when one does not expect to be interrupted." I nodded, understanding his meaning. The clock marked another quarter hour. Outside, the fog thickened, muffling the city still further. Baker Street felt increasingly removed from the bustle beyond, as though the house itself had chosen to withdraw for the evening. I was just beginning to feel that pleasant heaviness which precedes sleep when Holmes spoke again. "There are people," he said, "who live their lives with such care that even absence leaves a pattern." I turned toward him. "You speak as though you have someone in mind." "Not yet," he replied. "But I sense the approach of such a case." I raised an eyebrow. "And what gives you that impression?" Holmes gestured subtly toward the door. "The manner in which this evening refuses to conclude," he said. "It lingers." It was an evening that asked for very little. I found myself holding my breath. Holmes remained perfectly still. Several seconds passed. Then came the softest of knocks at the door below. Gas lamps glowed behind their glass casings like distant embers, and the sounds of the city arrived muted and unhurried. Hudson's footsteps approached the door, unhurried as ever. The murmur of voices followed, indistinct but polite. A pause. Then her familiar tread upon the stairs. Shadows rested easily along the walls, untroubled by movement. I had drawn the curtains shortly after dusk, and the familiar smell of coal smoke and polished wood filled the room with the quiet assurance of routine. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair near the hearth, his long frame at ease, his fingers loosely intertwined. His eyes were open, yet unfocused, as though they rested not upon the room before him, but upon some distant interior landscape known only to himself. It was a stillness I had learned not to disturb. On the small table beside him lay his violin, untouched for the moment, its polished surface catching a faint glimmer of firelight. The bow rested carefully across the strings, placed there with the unconscious precision that marked all his habits. I took my seat opposite him, with a book I had already read more than once. The gentleman who entered our sitting room did so as though stepping into a place already half known to him. He paused just inside the doorway, his hat held carefully in both hands, his posture neither stiff nor relaxed, but suspended somewhere between the two. He was of middle height, neatly dressed, and bore the unmistakable air of one accustomed to order rather than display. His coat was brushed, his boots clean, yet everything about him suggested restraint rather than pride. Sherlock Holmes regarded him for a moment without speaking. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate. Holmes often allowed a room to settle around a visitor before addressing him, as though giving both man and surroundings time to align themselves. "Please," Holmes said at last, gesturing toward the chair nearest the hearth. "Sit." "Mr. Latham," the man replied softly. "Henry Latham." He seated himself with care, placing his hat upon his knees rather than setting it aside. His gaze wandered briefly around the room, taking in the shelves of books, the violin, the quiet fire. There was no fear in his eyes, only a thoughtful unease. "You have come a long way this evening," Holmes observed. "Yes," Mr. Latham said, "though not far in distance." "Distance is rarely the deciding factor," Holmes replied. "It is usually hesitation." Mr. Latham gave a faint, rueful smile. "I stood outside for some time," he admitted. "Nearly a full minute," Holmes said gently. Mr. Latham's eyebrows rose slightly. "I did not think anyone could know that." Holmes inclined his head. "You waited until the gas lamp across the street was extinguished," he continued, "and until the sound of the last carriage had faded. You wished to arrive unseen, yet not unnoticed." Latham drew a slow breath. "Yes," he said, "that is precisely so." Holmes seated himself opposite him, his manner calm, his voice unhurried. "You need not be concerned," he said. "Nothing that occurs here will disturb the quiet you clearly value." At this, Mr. Latham's shoulders eased perceptibly. "That is reassuring," he said. I observed him closely now. His hands were steady, his breathing even. Whatever troubled him, it had not driven him into agitation. This was no man fleeing danger. It was, rather, a man troubled by something too subtle to name. "What brings you to Baker Street tonight?" Holmes asked. Mr. Latham hesitated, his gaze lowering briefly to the fire. "I am not certain," he said. "Or rather, I am not certain how to describe it." Holmes waited. "It is not a crime," Mr. Latham continued. "At least I do not believe it to be. Nothing has been stolen, nothing damaged." "Go on," Holmes said quietly. "I live alone," Latham said. "Have done so for some years now. My house is quiet, exceptionally so." Holmes nodded. "Quiet can be a condition," he said, "or a habit." Mr. Latham looked up at him. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." He shifted slightly in his chair. "For the past fortnight," he went on, "I have noticed small changes in my house each morning. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention." "What sort of changes?" Holmes asked. "A chair moved closer to the window," Mr. Latham replied. "A book returned to its shelf in a different order. Once, a lamp that I distinctly remember extinguishing was found trimmed and filled." I felt a stir of curiosity, though Holmes remained impassive. "And these changes occur at night?" Holmes asked. "Yes." "You have heard nothing?" Holmes continued. "No." "Seen nothing?" "No." Holmes leaned back slightly. "And yet you are certain these things were not as you left them?" "I am," Mr. Latham said with quiet conviction. "I am a man of routine, Mr. Holmes. I place things carefully. I remember where they are." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "There are few things more revealing than routine," he said. The fire shifted softly, settling into a steady glow. The room seemed to listen. "Have you examined the doors and windows?" Holmes asked. "Every morning," Mr. Latham replied. "They remain locked, bolted, in some cases. No sign of forced entry? None?" Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of his chair, not in impatience, but in gentle rhythm. "Does this trouble you because you feel threatened?" he asked. Mr. Latham considered. "No," he said slowly. "That is what confuses me. I do not feel afraid." "Then why are you here?" Holmes asked. Mr. Latham's gaze softened. "Because," he said, I feel unsettled, as though my house is remembering something that I have forgotten. Holmes's eyes met mine briefly. There was no surprise in them, only recognition. Tell me about your house, Holmes said. It is a narrow terrace in Bloomsbury, Mr. Latham replied. 2 floors. Modest, but well kept. I have lived there for most of my adult life. Alone? Holmes asked. Again, Mr. Latham hesitated. Yes, he said, for some time. Holmes did not press him further on that point. Instead, he asked, Do these changes occur every night? Not every night, Mr. Latham said, but often enough that I have come to expect them. And when you expect them, Holmes asked, do you ever find them absent? Yes, Mr. Latham said. On those mornings, the house feels incomplete. The word hung in the air. Holmes rose and crossed to the mantel, where the clock continued its steady marking of time. He regarded it for a moment, then turned back. Latham, he said, there are moments between sleeping and waking when the mind behaves with remarkable fidelity. Mr. Latham listened intently. It returns, Holmes continued, to habits formed long ago. It moves through familiar patterns without conscious thought. In such moments, we are not guided by intention, but by memory. The gentleman who entered our sitting room did so as though stepping into a place already half known to him. He paused just inside the doorway, his hat held carefully in both hands, his posture neither stiff nor relaxed, but suspended somewhere between the two. He was of middle height, neatly dressed, and bore the unmistakable air of one accustomed to order rather than display. His coat was brushed, his boots clean, yet everything about him suggested restraint rather than pride. Sherlock Holmes regarded him for a moment without speaking. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate. Holmes often allowed a room to settle around a visitor before addressing him, as though giving both man and surroundings time to align themselves. Please, Holmes said at last, gesturing toward the chair nearest the hearth. Sit. Mr. Latham, the man replied softly. Henry Latham. He seated himself with care, placing his hat upon his knees rather than setting it aside. His gaze wandered briefly around the room, taking in the shelves of books, the violin, the quiet fire. We departed Baker Street without haste. There was no urgency in Holmes's manner as he collected his coat and hat, nor any suggestion that the hour pressed upon us. Hudson wished us a quiet evening, her voice carrying the same steady kindness it always had, and the door closed behind us with a soft file sound. Outside, the fog received us without resistance. It lay along the street like a thin veil, allowing the lamps to glow through it rather than obscuring them. Baker Street appeared narrower than usual, its familiar lines softened, its edges less certain. The city seemed content to let us pass unnoticed. Mr. Latham walked beside us, his pace measured, his gaze lowered, not in distress, but in thought. Holmes set an unhurried rhythm, his footsteps steady, his presence reassuring. It is a pleasant night, Holmes observed. Yes, Mr. Latham replied. It reminds me of evenings when one could walk without purpose. Holmes inclined his head. Those are often the most revealing walks. We turned southward, leaving the brighter thoroughfares behind. The farther we went, the quieter the city became, until even the distant hum of activity faded into something almost imagined. You have lived in Bloomsbury many years, Holmes said conversationally. Most of my adult life, Mr. Latham replied. I came there when my work required little travel. And what work is that? Holmes asked. I catalog records, Mr. Latham said. Old ledgers, correspondence, inventories. I bring order to things that have long been neglected. A suitable occupation. Holmes said. Order has a memory of its own. Mr. Lapham smiled faintly. Yes, he said, that is what first appealed to me. We walked for some time without further conversation. The silence between us felt companionable, shaped by shared movement rather than absence. My own thoughts drifted easily, and I became aware of the rhythm of my breathing, the steady contact of my boots upon the pavement. Eventually, Mr. Latham slowed. We are nearly there, he said. The street he indicated was narrow and unassuming. The houses stood close together, their brickwork darkened by age, their windows uniformly curtained. There was nothing remarkable about the place at first glance, and perhaps that was its most notable quality. Holmes paused and regarded the row of houses with interest. Quiet, he said. Very quiet. Yes, Mr. Latham agreed. Even during the day. They proceeded to a door midway along the terrace. Mr. Latham produced his key and opened it with a practiced ease. The lock yielded smoothly, without resistance or sound. Inside, the air was cool and still. Mr. Latham lit a lamp in the narrow entryway, and its glow revealed a hall kept with careful simplicity. There were no ornaments, no excess of decoration. Everything appeared deliberate, as though each object had been given a specific purpose and then left undisturbed. This way, Mr. Latham said softly. He led us into a small sitting room at the front of the house. The furniture was arranged neatly, the chairs angled slightly toward one another. The table centered upon a modest rug. Books lined a single shelf, their spines lined with meticulous care. The clock above the mantel was the first thing I noticed. It was a handsome piece, well maintained, despite its silence. Its hands rested motionless upon the face, fixed at a time long past. Holmes stood before it for a moment, his gaze attentive, but unhurried. You do not wind it, he said. No, Mr. Latham replied. I never have. And yet, Holmes said, it is kept in perfect order. Mr. Latham nodded. I dust it regularly, he said. It seems proper. Holmes moved about the room with quiet consideration, his presence unobtrusive. He did not open drawers or examine locks. Instead, he observed how the light fell upon surfaces, how objects related to one another within the space. This chair, he said, indicating one by the window, is the one you find moved most often. Yes, Mr. Latham said. It is always closer to the light. Holmes nodded. And the books, they are sometimes rearranged, Mr. Latham replied. Not randomly, simply differently. Holmes turned toward the shelf and ran his fingers lightly along the spines without removing a single volume. By subject, he murmured, then by size. Mr. Latham looked surprised. That is how they were once kept, he said. Once? Holmes asked. Mr. Latham hesitated. Yes, he said quietly. Some time ago. The house remained still around us, its silence deep but not oppressive. I felt no sense of intrusion, only the curious impression that we were being allowed to stand there, tolerated rather than challenged. Holmes crossed to the window and drew back the curtain slightly. Outside, the street lay empty, the fog lending it an unreal quality. No one would pass unnoticed here, Holmes said, and yet no one has been seen. He let the curtain fall back into place. Latham, he continued, have you ever found something prepared for you in the morning? A lamp trimmed, perhaps, or a fire laid, but unlit. Mr. Latham's breath caught. Yes, he said, once or twice. Holmes nodded. Tell me, he said gently, do you sleep soundly? Mr. Latham considered. I sleep lightly, he said. Always have. I wake often, though rarely fully. Holmes's expression remained calm, but his eyes reflected a quiet certainty. That is as I suspected. He moved toward the door. "If you will permit it," he said, "I should like to see the rest of the house." "Of course," Mr. Latham replied. We ascended the narrow staircase, our steps careful and restrained. The upper rooms were much like the lower, simple, orderly, and unremarkable in the most deliberate way. In the bedroom, Holmes paused beside the bed. "You rise from here," he said softly, "without quite waking." Mr. Latham said nothing. "You move through the house," Holmes continued, "guided not by thought, but by familiarity. You restore things as they once were." Mr. Latham lowered himself onto the edge of the bed. "I did not know," he said. "No," Holmes replied. "Few do." He regarded Mr. Latham kindly. "There is nothing to fear," he said. "Your house is not being visited by another." Mr. Latham looked up. We departed Baker Street without haste. There was no urgency in Holmes's manner as he collected his coat and hat, nor any suggestion that the hour pressed upon us. Hudson wished us a quiet evening, her voice carrying the same steady kindness it always had, and the door closed behind us with a soft file sound. Outside, the fog received us without resistance. It lay along the street like a thin veil, allowing the lamps to glow through it rather than obscuring them. Baker Street appeared narrower than usual, its familiar lines softened, its edges less certain. The city seemed content to let us pass unnoticed. Mr. Latham walked beside us, his pace measured, his gaze lowered, not in distress, but in thought. Holmes set an unhurried rhythm, his footsteps steady, his presence reassuring. The room remained quiet. "You do not wander your house as a stranger," Holmes continued. "You move through it as someone deeply familiar, someone restoring balance." There was something about the air, the softened streets, that invited continuation rather than conclusion. The fog had thinned slightly, though it still lingered close to the ground, blurring the boundary between pavement and shadow. Our footsteps sounded distant, even to our own ears, as if the city itself were listening without comment. Mr. Latham walked between us now, his posture eased, his breathing slower than when we had first met him. He seemed less burdened, though the evening had offered him no sudden answers. Sometimes, I reflected, relief arrives before understanding. "You feel calmer," Holmes observed quietly. "Yes," Mr. Latham replied, "though I do not yet know why." Holmes inclined his head. "That is often the first sign that one is moving in the right direction." We paused at a corner where a solitary lamp cast a pale circle of light upon the stones. Holmes rested his gloved hand lightly against the post, as though grounding himself in moment. "Tell me," he said, "when you wake in the mornings and discover these changes, what is your first feeling?" Mr. Latham considered. "Recognition," he said at last, "followed by confusion." "Not fear?" Holmes asked. "No," Mr. Latham said, "never fear." Holmes nodded. "That distinction matters." He gestured gently with his free hand. "There are disturbances that announce themselves through alarm," he said, "and there are others that whisper familiarity. The latter are often misunderstood." We resumed our walk. "I have never found footprints," Mr. Latham said after a time. "No marks near the doors or windows, no evidence that someone has entered or left." "That is because no one has," Holmes replied calmly. Mr. Latham glanced at him. "Then how do you explain?" "Let us not explain yet," Holmes said gently. "Let us observe." The street opened onto a small square, its benches empty, its trees bare and motionless. The square felt untouched, as though it existed only for those who wandered without destination. Holmes seated himself upon one of the benches, motioning for us to do the same. "There is a particular kind of visitor," he said, "who leaves no trace because they do not arrive from elsewhere." Latham listened closely. They do not cross thresholds, Holmes continued. They do not open doors or touch locks. They move along paths already worn smooth by repetition. Latham's brow furrowed slightly. You speak of habit, he said. Yes, Holmes replied, but habit alone does not explain care. He rested his hands upon his knees. The changes you describe are not random, he said. They are attentive, considerate. They improve the order of the house rather than disturb it. Mr. Latham nodded slowly. That is true. And yet, Holmes continued, you do not remember making them. No, Holmes's voice softened. Memory does not always announce itself as recollection, he said. Sometimes it expresses itself as action. The square remained still around us. A cat crossed the far end, without sound, then disappeared into shadow. Tell me, Holmes said, do you dream, Mr. Latham smiled faintly. I do, he said, often of ordinary things, sitting by the fire, sorting papers, adjusting small details. Holmes smiled in return. And when you wake from these dreams, I feel unfinished, Mr. Latham said, as though something were left undone. Holmes rose from the bench. There are states of mind, he said, that exist between waking and sleeping. In such moments, the body remembers what the conscious mind has set aside. He turned toward Baker Street. Come, he said. There is little more to be learned outdoors. The walk back was quieter still. Mr. Latham spoke no further, and Holmes seemed content to let the silence do its work. When we reached 221B, Miss Hudson admitted us with a knowing glance, saying nothing beyond a gentle wish for warmth. The sitting room welcomed us back, unchanged, the fire still low, the clock marking time without urgency. Mr. Latham seated himself once more, though this time he set his hat aside. Holmes resumed his chair opposite him. You described a visitor, Holmes said, who leaves no trace. I would suggest instead that the trace is everywhere, but subtle. He gestured toward the orderly shelves, the carefully placed furniture. These are not the signs of intrusion, he continued. They are the signs of continuity. Mr. Latham's eyes moved slowly about the room. I once shared my home, he said quietly. Holmes waited. With my sister, Mr. Latham continued. She was attentive. She noticed small things. She had her ways. Holmes's voice was gentle. And those ways brought you comfort. Yes, Mr. Latham said. They did. Holmes nodded. When such habits are practiced over years, he said, they do not vanish easily. They become part of the rhythm of a place. Mr. Latham's expression softened. You believe, he said, that my house is remembering her. Holmes considered his words carefully. I believe, he said at last, that you are remembering her, without knowing that you do so. The room remained quiet. You do not wander your house as a stranger, Holmes continued. You move through it as someone deeply familiar, someone restoring balance. There was something about the air, the softened streets, that invited continuation rather than conclusion. The fog had thinned slightly, though it still lingered close to the ground, blurring the boundary between pavement and shadow. Our footsteps sounded distant, even to our own ears, as if the city itself were listening without comment. Mr. Latham walked between us now, his posture eased, his breathing slower than when we had first met him. He seemed less burdened, though the evening had offered him no sudden answers. Sometimes, I reflected, relief arrives before understanding. You feel calmer, Holmes observed quietly. Yes, Mr. Latham replied, though I do not yet know why. Holmes inclined his head. That is often the first sign that one is moving in the right direction. We paused at a corner where a solitary lamp cast a pale circle of light upon the stones. After Mr. Latham had gone, the sitting room at Baker Street fate subtly altered. Nothing had been moved. The chairs remained where they had been, the books undisturbed, the fire still burning low and steady. And yet there was a sense, difficult to describe, that something had been gently acknowledged and set back into place. Holmes remained standing for a few moments after the door had closed, his hand resting lightly upon the back of his chair. He did not speak at once, nor did he turn toward me. His gaze rested instead upon the quiet room, as though seeing it anew. At times, he said at last, a visitor leaves without leaving. I settled into my chair opposite him, allowing the stillness to return. You believe Mr. Latham will rest easier now, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, because uncertainty has been replaced with familiarity. He resumed his seat and leaned back, folding his hands loosely in his lap. The mind, he continued, is remarkably faithful to repetition. When something is done often enough, it no longer requires intention. The fire shifted softly, sending a wave of warmth through the room. I have encountered this phenomenon before, Holmes said, though rarely does it present itself so gently. In what way? I asked. In the way that memory expresses itself, he replied, not as thought, but as action. I considered this, watching the slow rise and fall of the flames. Mr. Latham described objects being moved, I said, but not taken, adjusted, but not disturbed. Precisely, Holmes said. These are not the actions of intrusion, they are the actions of care. He reached for his violin and lifted it, not to play, but to hold. His fingers rested upon the neck with a familiarity that spoke of countless evenings like this one. There are objects, he said, that become extensions of those who tend them. They retain a certain expectation. I smiled faintly. You speak as though objects possess memory. In a sense, they do, Holmes replied, but it is borrowed memory, lent to them by repetition. He set the violin gently upon his knee. Chair placed by the window each evening, he continued. A book returned to its shelf in a particular order. A clock wound at the same hour, night after night. The object learns its role, I said. Holmes nodded. And so does the body, he added. Silence returned, comfortable and unforced. Outside, the fog pressed softly against the windows, as though the world beyond had paused to listen. Mr. Latham's house, Holmes said after a time, is not haunted. I smiled at the word. No, he continued, it is inhabited by continuity. I reflected upon this. His sister, I said, her habits became shared habits, Holmes finished. And shared habits have a longer life than we often suppose. He leaned forward slightly. Consider the act of winding a clock, he said, a small thing, easily overlooked. Yet performed nightly, it becomes a gesture of reassurance, a confirmation that the day has been accounted for. And when such a gesture is no longer consciously performed, I asked. It may still be enacted, Holmes replied, by the body when the mind rests. The clock upon our mantel ticked steadily, as if in quiet agreement. I have often observed, Holmes said, that people who live alone develop a heightened relationship with their surroundings. Objects take on greater significance. Yes, I said. One notices small changes more readily. Indeed, Holmes replied, and one is also more likely to maintain order as a form of companionship. The firelight flickered across the walls, casting slow-moving shadows that seemed to drift rather than dance. Mr. Latham's changes, Holmes continued, are not disturbances, they are restorations. He paused. There is comfort in restoring what once was, he said, even when one does not remember doing so. I found myself growing drowsy, the cadence of Holmes's voice blending with the warmth of the room. Do you suppose, I asked, that such habits will fade? Holmes considered. Perhaps, he said, but not abruptly. Habits relinquish their hold only when gently replaced. With what? I asked. With awareness, Holmes replied, and acceptance. He rose and crossed to the window, parting the curtains slightly. Outside, the street lay quiet, the fog now thinning as the night deepened. Mr. Latham will begin to notice his movements, he said. Not with alarm, but with curiosity. And curiosity leads to understanding. He let the curtain fall back into place. Once understanding is present, he continued, the habit loses its urgency. The violin rested upon the chair where Holmes had left it, its polished surface reflecting the firelight. You have often spoken of the mind's hidden processes, I said, but rarely with such gentleness. Holmes smiled faintly. Because this is not a problem to be solved, he said. It is a rhythm to be recognized. He returned to his seat. There's the tendency, he continued, to treat all unexplained events as threats. But many are merely reminders. Reminders of what? I asked softly. Of who we have been, Holmes replied, and of the patterns that once shaped our days. The clock chimed quietly, marking the hour without ceremony. I felt the day's weariness settle over me at last, not as exhaustion, but as release. Holmes noticed. You should rest, he said. Tonight has required little of us, but even little things ask for attention. I nodded. And you? I asked. Holmes glanced toward the violin once more. I may play, he said. Very softly, or perhaps, he added after a pause, I may simply sit. Both options seemed equally fitting. As I prepared to retire, I reflected that this case, if it could even be called such, had unfolded without urgency, without confrontation, and without disruption. It had revealed itself not through force, but through patience, and perhaps, I thought, that was its true lesson. That some mysteries are not solved by seeking answers, but by allowing understanding to arrive in its own time. Fire burned low. The clock continued its gentle marking of moments, and the objects around us, faithful in their places, seemed content to remain exactly where they were. The night advanced without announcement. Time, within the sitting room at Baker Street, no longer seemed to move forward so much as to settle gently around us. The fire had burned itself into a steady glow, and the clock upon the mantel marked each minute with patient regularity. I had not yet retired, though drowsiness rested upon me like a familiar cloak. Holmes remained seated, his posture relaxed, his gaze thoughtful but untroubled. The violin lay untouched beside him, as if awaiting a moment that might or might not arrive. After a long interval of silence, Holmes spoke again. There are questions, he said, that should never be asked abruptly. I looked toward him. And others? I asked. That should be asked only when the answer is ready, he replied. He folded his hands together, fingertips resting lightly against one another. When people come to us, he continued, they often expect interrogation. They brace themselves against suspicion. Yes, I said. Mr. Latham seemed prepared for that. And yet, Holmes said, what he required was permission. Permission? I echoed. To speak without defense, Holmes replied. To consider his experience without fear of consequence. He rose and moved slowly about the room, his footsteps scarcely audible against the rug. "The mind," he said, "reveals more when it is not pursued." I watched as he paused beside the bookcase, adjusting a single volume that had shifted slightly. "Holmes," I said, "you never asked Mr. Latham when these changes began." Holmes smiled faintly. "I did," he said, "but not directly," I replied. "Precisely." He returned to his chair. "There are moments," he said, "when directness obscures rather than clarifies." The room felt particularly still now, as though every sound had found its place and was content to remain there. "Consider the nature of his disturbances," Holmes continued. "They were not disruptive. They were restorative." "Yes," I said. "You remarked upon that earlier." "And what kind of visitor," Holmes asked, "comes only to restore?" "I considered this. One who belongs," I said at last. Holmes nodded. "That is the correct answer," he said. "But the more important question is why he did not recognize himself as such." He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. Long practiced, quietly maintained. When such routine is interrupted, the body often attempts to preserve it, even without instruction, I said. "Especially without instruction," Holmes replied. The fire crackled softly, then settled again. "Mr. Latham's life," Holmes continued, "has been one of careful order. His profession, his habits, his home, all reflect a desire for structure." "Yes," I said, "and structure provides comfort." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "but when that structure is shared, it becomes more resilient." He opened his eyes. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "what did you notice about Mr. Latham's manner when he spoke of his sister?" I reflected for a moment. "He did not speak with grief," I said. "At least, not openly." "No," Holmes agreed. "He spoke with continuity." I nodded. "It was as though she had not entirely departed," I said, "only receded." Holmes smiled. "Well observed," he said. He rose once more, crossed to the mantel, resting his elbow lightly against it. "Loss," he said, "is often imagined as an event. In truth, it is a process." "And habits," I said, "are reluctant to acknowledge such processes." Holmes inclined his head. "They resist finality," he said. "They prefer repetition." The clock chimed quietly, marking another hour. "It is late," I observed. "And yet," Holmes replied, "there is no urgency." He glanced toward the window. "Mr. Latham will return to his house tonight," he said. "He will sleep." "And what will occur?" I asked. "Possibly nothing," Holmes replied. "Or possibly the same gentle adjustments as before." "And that will trouble him less?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes said, "because his questions have changed." I considered this. "He no longer asks who," I said, "but why." "Precisely," Holmes replied. He returned to his chair, settling into it with ease. "When questions shift from alarm to curiosity," he said, "the mind follows." Silence returned, deep and unbroken. I found my thoughts slowing, my attention drifting without effort. "Holmes," I said softly, "have you ever experienced something similar?" He did not answer at once. Then he said, "All men do." I looked at him. "In what way?" I asked. "In the persistence of habit," he replied. "In the continuation of small rituals long after their original purpose has faded." He glanced toward the violin. "There are evenings," he said, "when I reach for this instrument without intending to play." "And do you play?" I asked. "Sometimes," Holmes replied. "Sometimes I merely hold it." The distinction seemed meaningful. "There are things," he continued, "that anchor us. They remind us of continuity." "Yes," I said. "And when such anchors are disturbed," Holmes said, The mind seeks to restore them. The fire burned low, casting long, steady shadows. I believe, Holmes said, that Miss Latham's case will resolve itself quietly. No dramatic conclusion? I asked. No, Holmes replied. Only gradual understanding. I felt a gentle contentment settle over me. That seems fitting, I said. Holmes smiled faintly. Not all resolutions announce themselves, he said. Some simply arrive. The clock ticked on. I realized then that my own breathing had slowed, matching the rhythm of the room. Watson, Holmes said, you should retire. Yes, I said, I believe I shall. As I rose, Holmes spoke once more. There will be no further visits tonight, he said. Nothing more to attend to. I paused. And tomorrow? I asked. Holmes considered. Tomorrow, he said, will be much the same. He reached for the violin at last, lifting it gently, which, he added, is often the best possible outcome. I left him there, seated by the fire, the instrument resting lightly in his hands. Behind me, the room remained warm and still, the objects within it faithful to their places. And as I prepared for sleep, I reflected that this case, like the night itself, asked for nothing more than patience. Sometimes that is enough. Morning arrived without insistence. Light filtered gently through the curtains at Baker Street, pale and unhurried, as though the day itself were reluctant to disturb the peace of the night that had come before it. I awoke rested, with none of the abruptness that sometimes accompanied the conclusion of a case. Downstairs, the sitting room was already awake. Holmes sat by the window, the curtains parted, just enough to admit the soft gray of early London. The fire had been rebuilt and burned quietly, and the kettle murmured on the hob nearby. Everything suggested continuity rather than commencement. You slept well, Holmes observed without turning. Yes, I replied. Uncommonly so. Holmes nodded. The mind rests best when it is not anticipating interruption. Breakfast passed with little conversation. Holmes seemed content to let the morning unfold at its own pace, his attention divided between the street below and his thoughts. After some time he rose and reached for his coat. A walk, he said, before the day grows crowded. We stepped out into Baker Street, which still bore the softness of early hour. The shops were shuttered, the pavements lightly trafficked. London, in this moment, belonged not to industry or urgency, but to reflection. We walked without destination. Holmes set an easy pace, neither hurried nor slow, allowing the rhythm of movement to establish itself. I found my thoughts drifting freely, unanchored by expectation. London, Holmes said after a time, reveals itself most honestly at this hour. How so? I asked. It has not yet assumed its many roles, he replied. It is neither marketplace nor thoroughfare. It simply exists. We turned down a side street, where the houses stood close together, their windows still dark. A single cat sat upon a doorstep, regarding us without interest as we passed. You often speak of observation, I said, but this feels different. Yes, Holmes replied. This is listening. He gestured toward the quiet street. Cities, he said, have rhythms much like people, and like people, they are most truthful when unguarded. We crossed a small bridge where the water below moved slowly, reflecting the muted sky. Miss Latham's house, I said, felt much like this street. Holmes inclined his head. Unassuming, he said, orderly, comfortable with itself, and yet, I added, capable of surprising its occupant. Holmes smiled faintly. Only when he stopped listening to himself We paused near a row of benches, each damp with dew. Holmes rested his hand upon the back of one, then withdrew it, without sitting. "There are moments," he said, "when movement itself clarifies thought." I nodded. "Walking," Holmes continued, "engages the body just enough to allow the mind to loosen its hold." We resumed our walk, turning toward Bloomsbury, without having consciously chosen to do so. The district was quiet, its streets wide and orderly. Trees stood motionless, their branches bare against the pale sky. "Mr. Latham will wake today," Holmes said, with less need to examine his surroundings. "And if he finds something moved?" I asked. "He will recognize it," Holmes replied, "not as intrusion, but as continuation." We stopped before his street, though we did not approach the house itself. "Observation," Holmes said, "does not always require proximity." We stood in silence for a time, the street empty and receptive. "Do you hear that?" Holmes asked. I listened. At first, I heard nothing. Then gradually, the subtle sounds merged. The distant roll of a cart, the faint call of a bird, the whisper of wind through branches. "Yes," I said. "Though it is very quiet," Holmes nodded. "Absence of sound is rarely complete," he said. "It is merely layered." He turned back toward Baker Street, the walk retracing itself with the same gentle ease. As we walked, Holmes spoke of small things, of books recently acquired, of a passage of music he had been considering, of the way certain streets seemed narrower in memory than in fact. None of it required response. It was enough to listen. When at last we returned home, the day had begun to assert itself. The city as sounds grew gradually louder, though they remained distant, contained. Back in the sitting room, Holmes removed his coat and returned it to its place. That, he said, was sufficient. "For what?" I asked. "For clarity," he replied. I felt it too, a quiet settling, as though something intangible had found its proper position. "There will be no further action today," Holmes said. "No letters to write?" I asked. "No visits to make?" he replied. "Nothing to pursue." He seated himself once more by the fire. "This case," he said, "has already resolved itself." I smiled. "Without effort, without force," Holmes corrected. The clock marked the hour. Outside, London resumed its usual cadence, though Baker Street retained its calm. Holmes reached for his violin. At last. "I think," he said, "that some music would suit the morning." He played softly, nothing elaborate, nothing demanding. The notes rose and fell gently, filling the room without overwhelming it. I listened as the sound mingled with the fire's warmth and the steady passage of time, and I reflected that this case, unlike so many others, had not required pursuit or confrontation. It had required only attention. Sometimes, I thought, that is all that is needed. We returned to Bloomsbury later that same day, not because the case demanded it, but because Holmes believed it fitting. The afternoon had passed gently. No telegrams arrived. No visitors disturbed the calm of Baker Street. The city moved about its affairs without reference to us, and we allowed it to do so. As dusk approached, Holmes rose and set aside his book. "The house," he said simply. I nodded, understanding his meaning at once. We made our way through London as the light faded, the sky shifting slowly from pale gray to a softer, deeper hue. The streets were busier now than they had been in the morning, but there was no urgency in our steps. We walked not to intercept events, but to observe their quiet settling. Bloomsbury received us much as it had the night before. The narrow street appeared unchanged, its houses standing close and orderly, their windows reflecting the last light of day. Lamps were being lighted one by one, their glow steady and unremarkable. We stopped opposite Mr. Latham's house. Holmes did not approach the door. Instead, he stood for a moment, hands clasped behind his back, regarding the façade with thoughtful attention. "There is nothing remarkable here," he said. "No," I agreed. And yet, Holmes continued, "it invites familiarity." We crossed the street slowly, our footsteps unhurried. Holmes paused beside the front window, careful not to intrude upon the light within. The curtain was drawn, but not fully closed. Through the gap, we could see the sitting room. The chairs were arranged as before. The table was centered upon its rug. The clock above the mantel remained silent, and Mr. Latham sat by the fire. He held a book, though he did not appear to be reading. His gaze was distant, his posture relaxed. There was no tension in his manner, no trace of the unease that had brought him to Baker Street the night before. Holmes watched quietly. "You see?" he murmured. "Yes," I said softly. We moved a little farther along the street, giving the house its privacy. "He is not searching," Holmes said. "That is important. What do you expect will happen tonight?" I asked. Holmes considered. "Possibly nothing," he replied. "Possibly the same small adjustments as before." "And if they occur?" I asked. "They will no longer trouble him," Holmes said, "because he has stopped interpreting them as intrusion." We remained there for a time, letting the street settle into evening. A woman passed, carrying a parcel. A man walked briskly, his footsteps echoing briefly before fading. Then the street grew quiet once more. Holmes leaned lightly against the railing. "Houses," he said, "acquire a character not through architecture, but through repetition." I nodded. "Mr. Latham's house," Holmes continued, "has been shaped by attentiveness." "And that attentiveness persists," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "even when its origin is no longer consciously recalled." The sky darkened gradually, the lamps now fully asserting themselves. The house before us glowed softly from within, its light warm and contained. "There is no need to enter," Holmes said. "No," I agreed. "It feels complete." We turned away at last, leaving the narrow street behind. As we walked, Holmes spoke quietly. "People often imagine that resolution arrives as a moment," he said. "A revelation, a confrontation, a declaration. And this," I said, "has been none of those." "No," Holmes replied. "This has been a recognition." We walked on, the city unfolding gently around us. By the time we reached Baker Street, night had fully settled. Mrs. Hudson had lit the lamps, and the sitting room welcomed us with familiar warmth. Holmes removed his coat and paused beside the fire. "The narrow house in Bloomsbury," he said, "will remain just that." "And the visitor?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "He will learn," he said, "that he has never truly been absent." The clock marked the hour. I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me, not the sharp relief of a case concluded, but the deeper contentment of something understood. Holmes reached for his violin but did not play. "Some evenings," he said, "are improved by restraint." He returned the instrument to its place and took his seat. Outside, London continued its rhythm, untroubled by our observations. Inside, the objects at Baker Street remained where they had always been, faithful and unremarkable. And somewhere in Bloomsbury, a narrow house stood quietly, its rooms holding no secrets, only memories that had learned, at last, to rest. Night returned to Baker Street without ceremony. The city outside had settled into its familiar cadence, not silent, but subdued, its sounds softened by distance and routine. Within the sitting room, the fire burned low and steady, casting a gentle warmth that seemed to slow even the passage of thought. Holmes sat quietly in his chair, his posture relaxed, his gaze unfocused. I had taken up my customary place opposite him. Though the book in my hands remained unopened, reading felt unnecessary. The evening asked only for presence. For a long while, neither of us spoke. It was in such moments that I became most aware of the room itself. The chairs seemed to rest rather than stand. The books upon the shelves appeared content in their alignment. Even the clock, with its patient ticking, felt less like a measure of time and more like a reassurance that nothing required attention. Rooms, Holmes said at last, are rarely empty. I looked up. Even when unoccupied? I asked. Especially then, he replied. He shifted slightly, adjusting his position without disturbing the stillness. Rooms absorb patterns, he continued. They learn the rhythms of those who inhabit them. I considered the sitting room around us. You believe rooms remember? I said. Holmes smiled faintly. They remember in the only way they can, he said, by expectation. The fire gave a soft murmur as a log settled. Consider, Holmes went on, a room long used for quiet reflection. Over time, it becomes inhospitable to noise. Sound feels out of place there. Yes, I said, as though it does not belong. Exactly, Holmes replied. The same may be said of disorder in a room shaped by care. I nodded, thinking of Mr. Latham's house. His rooms, I said, felt as though they were waiting. Yes, Holmes said, but not anxiously. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. They were waiting in the way one waits for evening, he continued, with patience. The silence deepened, though it remained comfortable. There are people, Holmes said, who leave a room more orderly than they found it. And others, I added, who leave it unchanged. Holmes nodded. And a few, he said, who leave it expectant. The clock marked the passing of another quarter hour. I found myself growing aware of my own breathing, slow and even. The room seemed to encourage such attentiveness, as though it rewarded stillness with calm. Mr. Latham's house, Holmes said, has learned to pause. In what way? I asked. It holds its breath, he replied, not from fear, but from habit. I thought of the narrow Bloomsbury Street, the quiet sitting room, the silent clock. It is waiting for a pattern to complete itself, Holmes continued, and until that happens, it remains attentive. Can a room release such expectation? I asked. Holmes considered. Yes, he said, but only gradually. He opened his eyes and looked toward the fire. When the occupant no longer responds automatically, he explained, the room adjusts. So awareness changes the room, I said. As much as it changes the person, Holmes replied. The firelight shifted, shadows moving lazily across the walls. There are moments, Holmes said, when a room feels as though it is listening. I smiled. I have felt that, I said, particularly late at night. Those are the moments, Holmes replied, when we are most honest with ourselves. Silence returned. I became aware then of how little had been required of us in this case. No pursuit, no deduction performed at speed, no confrontation, only observation. It occurs to me, I said, after some time, that this case could never have been resolved by force. Holmes smiled faintly. No, he said, force would have startled it. Startled what? I asked. The pattern, he replied. The clock kicked on. There are rooms, Holmes continued, that respond poorly to intrusion. They close themselves. And others? I asked. That open, he said. If approached correctly. He rose and crossed the room slowly, his steps measured. He paused beside the bookcase, his fingers brushing lightly against the spines. These books, he said, have been handled many times. Yes, I said, they show it. And yet, Holmes said, they remain orderly. He returned to his chair. Order, he said, does not preclude use. It merely reflects care. The thought seemed to settle comfortably in the room. Outside, a carriage passed, its sound distant and brief. Then the quiet resumed. "Do you suppose," I asked, "that Mr. Latham's house will ever feel entirely still to him again?" Holmes considered the question. "Yes," he said, "but stillness will mean something different to him now." "How so?" I asked. "He will recognize it as chosen," Holmes replied, "not imposed." I nodded. "That makes all the difference," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "When people live alone," he said, "they often mistake continuity for disturbance, and disturbance for intrusion," I added. "Precisely," Holmes said. The fire burned lower still, its warmth lingering even as its light dimmed. "Rooms that hold their breath," Holmes said softly, "do so because they have learned that something is expected of them." "And when nothing is expected?" I asked. "They exhale," he replied. The image was a comforting one. I felt my thoughts slowing further, the edges of awareness softening. "This room," Holmes said, "knows it will not be disturbed tonight, and so it rests," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied. He reached for his violin at last, lifting it with care. He did not play at once. Instead, he held it quietly, as though acknowledging its presence. "Music," he said, "is sometimes unnecessary." I smiled. "It already feels complete," I said. Holmes returned the violin to its place. "There is nothing more to do this evening," he said. The clock marked the hour. I rose slowly, feeling no reluctance, only readiness. "Good night, Holmes," I said. "Good night, Watson," he replied. As I retired, the sitting room remained behind me, warm, orderly, attentive, yet content to release its breath. And in Bloomsbury, I imagined a narrow house doing the same. Rooms, after all, only wait as long as they are asked to. The night grew deeper, though nothing about it announced the fact. At Baker Street, time seemed less like a sequence of moments and more like a gentle presence, one that sat quietly in the room, content to remain unnoticed. The fire had settled into a steady, glowing hush, and the shadows it cast upon the walls moved so slowly that they appeared almost fixed. I awoke briefly, uncertain how long I had slept, and lay still for a moment, listening. The house was calm, not silent, exactly, but composed. There was the faint creak of settling wood, the distant murmur of London far beyond the walls, and beneath it all, the soft, unwavering tick of the clock upon the mantel. It was that sound which drew me fully awake. I rose and made my way downstairs, careful not to disturb the quiet. Holmes sat exactly where I had last seen him, his long frame at ease in the chair by the hearth, his gaze resting upon the fire as though it required no attention to be understood. "You heard it," he said softly, without turning. "Yes," I replied. "The clock." Holmes nodded. "Clocks," he said, "are among the most honest of objects." I took my seat opposite him. "They speak," Holmes continued, "without language. They do not persuade, nor do they conceal. They mark what passes, whether we attend to them or not." The clock's face gleamed faintly in the firelight. Its hands moved with measured certainty, neither hurried nor delayed. "You noticed the clock in Mr. Latham's house?" Holmes said. "Yes," I replied. "It had been stopped for years, and yet," Holmes said, "it remained central." I nodded. "It was positioned as though it mattered," I said. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "A stopped clock does not cease to signify. It merely changes what it signifies." The fire shifted, releasing a brief warmth before settling again. "When a clock is wound each night," Holmes continued, "it becomes part of an evening ritual, a punctuation mark at the close of the day. And when the ritual ends? I asked. The habit often remains, Holmes replied, even when the mechanism does not. I thought of Latham's quiet house. The silent clock above the mantel, kept polished and respected, despite its stillness. He did not wind it, I said, but it was never neglected. Holmes smiled faintly. That distinction is important. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows upon his knees. There are objects, he said, that we cease to use, but never cease to acknowledge. Yes, I said. They remain. They do, Holmes agreed, and in remaining, they continue to shape us. The clock kicked on. Mr. Latham's clock once spoke for 2, Holmes said. Its winding marked a shared moment. When that moment passed, the sound became unnecessary. And yet, I said, the place for it remained. Precisely, Holmes replied. He rose and crossed the room, stopping beneath our own clock. He regarded it thoughtfully, as though listening not only to its sound, but to what it implied. There is comfort, he said, in knowing that something measures time on one's behalf. Yes, I replied. It relieves us of the responsibility. Holmes nodded. And when that responsibility is shared, he added, its absence is felt more keenly. He returned to his chair. Miss Latham's case, Holmes said, is not about intrusion. No, I agreed. It is about continuation. Yes, Holmes said, but continuation without awareness. The clock marked another minute. In such cases, Holmes continued, the mind seeks to restore balance. It recreates the familiar gestures that once brought reassurance, and does so without waking, I said. Often, Holmes replied. The boundary between sleeping and waking is more permeable than we suppose. I felt the truth of this keenly, sitting there in the low firelight, the night pressing gently against the windows. There are hours, Holmes said, when the body acts with greater honesty than the conscious mind. Yes, I said, I felt that. Holmes smiled faintly. Most people have, he said. Few notice. The fire dimmed slightly, though the warmth remained. Tell me, Watson, Holmes said, do you ever wake and find something placed differently than you remember? I considered. Yes, I said slowly. A book left open. A chair moved. And does it alarm you? Holmes asked. No, I replied. It feels familiar. Holmes nodded. Exactly. He leaned back, folding his hands loosely. Miss Latham's concern arose not from fear, he said, but from dissonance. His conscious mind did not recall the act, and so he questioned its origin. And now, I said, he no longer needs to. No, Holmes replied. He has been given permission to recognize himself. The clock chimed softly, marking the hour with restraint. Outside, the city responded faintly, some distant sound acknowledging the passage of time, then fading again. There are clocks, Holmes said, that announce themselves loudly, and others, I added, that speak only to those who listen. Holmes smiled. Mr. Latham's clock, he said, has been silent long enough. I looked up. You believe it will be wound again? I asked. Holmes considered. Perhaps, he said, or perhaps it will remain still, but with different meaning. How so? I asked. Stillness, Holmes replied, can be chosen. I nodded. That, too, is a form of speech, I said. Holmes inclined his head. When we choose stillness, he said, we are no longer haunted by it. Firelight flickered across the clock's face, the hands moving steadily onward. There's a reason, Holmes said, why clocks occupy such prominent places in rooms. To be seen, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, but also to be trusted. The room felt especially quiet now, as though the clock's steady voice had lulled everything else into rest. "Mr. Latham will wake tomorrow," Holmes said, and his house will feel different to him." "In what way?" I asked. "It will feel honest," Holmes replied. "No longer mysterious." "And the clock?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "It will speak again," he said, "whether through sound or silence." I felt my own thoughts slowing, the night reclaiming me gently. "There is nothing more to be done," Holmes said. "No," I agreed. The clock ticked on. Holmes reached for his violin, lifted it briefly, then set it aside once more. "Some sounds," he said, "are best left unplayed." I nodded. As I prepared to return to my room, I paused. "Holmes," I said, "this case feels complete." "Yes," he replied, "because it has returned to its beginning." I left him there, seated by the fire, the clock keeping its faithful watch. And as I drifted back towards sleep, the steady rhythm followed me, not insistent, not demanding, only present, like memory itself. The following days passed without incident. No messages arrived at Baker Street. No urgent footsteps climbed the stairs. No sudden revelations demanded attention. The world, it seemed, had decided to proceed quietly, and Holmes and I allowed it to do so. Such intervals were not uncommon, though they were rarely remarked upon. They existed between cases, between demands, soft stretches of time in which nothing pressed forward, and therefore everything could be observed. Holmes spent much of those days reading. He chose his books with particular care, favoring volumes that invited reflection rather than exertion. More than once, I noticed him pause mid-page, not because he had been interrupted, but because a thought had settled and wished to be considered before the reading continued. I, for my part, found myself returning often to the image of Mr. Latham's house. There was something about it, its narrowness, its restraint, that lingered in the mind. It had not asked to be remembered, and yet it had made itself quietly unforgettable. One afternoon, as the light slanted gently through the sitting-room windows, I voiced this thought aloud. "You are thinking of him," Holmes said, without looking up. "Yes," I replied. "Or perhaps of the way he lives." Holmes closed his book and regarded me thoughtfully. "Life lived carefully," he said. "Leaves impressions." "In people?" I asked. "In places," he replied, "and in time." He rose and moved toward the window, parting the curtains slightly. "Most lives," Holmes continued, "announce themselves through excess, through movement, noise, accumulation." "And Mr. Latham's?" I asked. "Through restraint," Holmes replied, "which is far rarer." The street below lay calm, the afternoon traffic unhurried. "Tell me," Holmes said, "what did you notice first upon entering his house?" I considered. "The order," I said. "Not a rigid order, but a thoughtful one." Holmes nodded. "That distinction is crucial." He returned to his chair. "There's a difference," he said, "between control and care." "Yes," I said. "Control demands attention. Care invites it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Mr. Latham's house does not enforce order," he said. "It suggests it." I found the observation illuminating. "He does not live defensively," I said. "There were no locks within locks, no barriers beyond what was necessary." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "A man who expects disturbance prepares for it." "And a man who does not?" I asked. "He prepares for continuity," Holmes said. The fire murmured softly. "Mr. Latham's routines," Holmes continued, "were not born of fear. They were born of partnership." I nodded. "He and his sister," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "They shared a life shaped by attentiveness. He leaned forward slightly. When two people live together for many years, he said, their habits intertwine. They cease to belong to one or the other. They become shared, I said. Holmes inclined his head. And when one is gone, he added, the habits remain undecided. They linger, uncertain where to settle. I reflected on this. Most people, I said, try to remove reminders. Yes, Holmes replied. But Mr. Latham did not. No, I said. He maintained them. Holmes smiled. Not consciously, he said, but faithfully. The clock ticked on, marking time without insistence. Such lives, Holmes continued, are rarely dramatic. They do not attract attention. And yet, I said, they endure. Yes, Holmes replied, because they are built upon repetition. He rose again and moved slowly about the room, as though illustrating his point through motion. Consider the act of care, he said. It is not performed once. It is performed once. It is performed again and again. And eventually, I said, it becomes invisible. Exactly, Holmes replied. He paused beside the fireplace. Invisibility, he said, is the final stage of habit. The thought settled comfortably. I wonder, I said, whether Mr. Latham ever questioned his life before this. Holmes considered. No, he said. I suspect he found it satisfactory. And then something changed, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. Awareness. I looked at him. Awareness of what? I asked. Of absence, Holmes said. The word lingered. Absence, he continued, is not always felt immediately. Sometimes it reveals itself through small dissonances. I nodded slowly. A chair moved, I said. A book rearranged. Exactly, Holmes replied. The house attempted to reconcile past and present. And Mr. Latham noticed, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, but he misinterpreted the cause. The fire burned steadily, its warmth consistent. A life lived carefully, Holmes said, is often ill-prepared for ambiguity. I considered this. Because it expects continuity, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. And when continuity behaves unexpectedly, it unsettles. He returned to his chair. Mr. Latham did not fear intrusion, Holmes said. He feared misalignment. That his life had become unrecognizable, I said. Holmes nodded. And yet, he said, nothing fundamental had changed. The clock chimed softly. I believe, Holmes said, that Mr. Latham's awareness will now deepen rather than disturb. In what way? I asked. He will begin to notice his habits, Holmes replied, not as compulsions, but as expressions. And that will bring comfort? I asked. Yes, Holmes said, because meaning has been restored. The room felt especially calm now, as though the discussion itself had smoothed its edges. Lives lived carefully, Holmes continued, rarely require correction. They require recognition. I smiled faintly. That seems a fitting conclusion, I said. Holmes smiled in return. We are not yet concluded, he said gently, but we are well underway. Outside, the light had begun to fade, the afternoon surrendering gradually to evening. I expect, Holmes said, that we shall hear from Mr. Latham again. And if we do not? I asked. Holmes considered. Then that, too, will be an answer. The clock ticked on. I felt the weight of the day settle pleasantly upon me. This case, I said, has required little from us and offered much, Holmes replied. I nodded. As evening approached, the sitting room grew warmer, quieter. The world beyond the windows receded. And somewhere in Bloomsbury, I imagined Ninro House standing at rest, its rooms no longer holding their breath, but breathing easily, content in the knowledge that the life within it had been lived carefully and continued still. It was several evenings later that we heard from Mr. Latham again. His note arrived without urgency, delivered by the afternoon post, and written in the careful, even hand. There was no alarm in his words, no request for immediate assistance. Instead, it carried the tone of one who wished simply to be understood. Holmes read it slowly, then handed it to me without comment. "My dear Mr. Holmes, I hope this finds you well. I write not because anything has worsened, but because something has clarified. You suggested, on our last meeting, that understanding sometimes follows quietly. I believe I now know what you meant." The remainder of the letter spoke not of disturbance, but of recollection. Mr. Latham described his sister, not dramatically, nor sentimentally, but with the same precision that seemed to guide every other aspect of his life. She had been, he wrote, a woman of habit, not rigid habit, but considered routine. She rose at the same hour each morning, preferred the same chair by the window, and arranged her books, not merely by subject, but by the order in which she was most likely to consult them. She liked, Mr. Latham wrote, for things to be prepared before they were required. Holmes returned to his chair by the fire as I finished reading. "Yes," he said quietly, "that lines." I looked at him. "You knew," I said. "I suspected," Holmes replied. "But suspicion is not understanding." The fire burned low, its warmth steady and reassuring. Mr. Latham's letter continued. He described evenings spent in quiet companionship, each absorbed in separate tasks, yet comforted by the presence of the other. His sister, he wrote, would wind the clock each night, trim the lamp, and ensure that the chairs were returned to their proper places before retiring. These were small acts, he wrote, but they gave shape to the day. Holmes nodded as I read. "Routine," he said, "is a form of care when it is shared." Mr. Latham went on to explain that after his sister's passing, he had continued to live much as before. He had not removed her chair, nor altered the arrangement of the room. He had simply continued. She would have preferred it so, he wrote. The letter paused there, as though allowing the thought to settle. "When one lives alongside another for many years," Holmes said, "the boundary between one's own habits and theirs becomes indistinct." "Yes," I said, "their routines had merged." "Precisely," Holmes replied, "and when she was gone, the routines did not know how to separate." The remainder of the letter described the gradual realization Latham had experienced in the days since our visit. He had begun to notice moments of movement he could not fully recall, standing by the shelf longer than necessary, adjusting a chair without conscious intent, pausing beside the clock at night, his hand resting upon it, though he did not wind it. "I do not believe," he wrote, "that I am being visited. I believe I am remembering." Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "That," he said, "is the distinction he needed." Mr. Latham did not describe these realizations with distress. There was no panic, no fear of losing himself. Instead, he wrote of them with a quiet curiosity, as though observing a familiar pattern from a new angle. "I had thought," he wrote, "that routine belonged to the living moment only. I see now that it may extend beyond it." Holmes regarded the letter thoughtfully. "Routine," he said, "is rarely about efficiency. It is about reassurance." The letter concluded simply, "I wished you to know that I am quite well. The house feels less puzzling now. It feels patient. Thank you for listening when I did not yet know how to speak." Holmes folded the letter carefully and placed it upon the table. "You see," he said, "how gently this resolves." "Yes," I replied. "There is no ending exactly." "No," Holmes said, "only a reframing." He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out at the street beyond. The sister, he continued, was not a presence to be removed. She was a pattern, I said. Holmes nodded. And patterns, he said, do not vanish. They adapt. The room remained quiet. I find it remarkable, I said, how much of a life can be expressed through such small gestures. Holmes smiled faintly. The smallest gestures, he said, are often the most enduring. He returned to his chair. There's a tendency, Holmes continued, to associate memory with images or words. But for many, memory lives in motion. In the body, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. And in routine. The fire settled further, its glow deepening. Mr. Latham's sister, Holmes said, loved routine, not because she lacked imagination, but because she valued continuity. Yes, I said, she wanted things to be ready. Holmes inclined his head. She prepared the world each evening, he said, so that morning could arrive without concern. I felt the gentleness of the thought settle over me. And now, I said, he prepares it without knowing, or rather, Holmes corrected, he prepared it without understanding. And now he understands, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, and so the action loses its mystery. The clock chimed quietly. Holmes rose once more and approached it, resting his hand briefly upon mantel. There may come a night, he said, when Mr. Latham winds his clock again. And if he does not, I asked. Holmes smiled. Then the stillness will be chosen, he said. The distinction felt important. Outside, the light had faded completely, the lamps casting steady pools of warmth upon a street. I'll doubt, Holmes said. We shall hear from Mr. Latham again. Because the matter is settled? I asked. Yes, Holmes replied, and because settled matters rarely announce themselves. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the ease of it all. This case, I said, has been unlike any other. Holmes smiled faintly, because it did not require us to act, he said, only to notice. The fire burned low, the letter rested quietly upon the table, and somewhere in Bloomsbury, a narrow house continued its gentle routines, no longer as a question, but as a memory made peaceful. There are habits that announce themselves loudly. They insist upon attention. They disrupt when interrupted. They demand to be noticed and defended. Such habits are easily identified, easily named, and often easily abandoned. But there are others, far quieter, far more enduring. These do not call attention to themselves. They settle into the background of a life and become indistinguishable from the passing of time itself. They persist, not because they are enforced, but because they are comforting. It was of such habits that Holmes spoke that evening. We sat together at Baker Street as dusk gathered once more, the room lit by a single lamp and the low fire. Outside, London moved steadily through its routines, but within our walls, the day seemed content to conclude gently. Habits, Holmes said, are often mistaken for actions. I looked up from my chair. In what way? I asked. In that they are assumed to require intention, he replied. Most do not. He leaned back, his hands resting loosely at his sides. The habits that outlive us, he continued, are rarely chosen. They are absorbed. I considered this. From those we live with, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, and from the environments we inhabit. The fire gave a soft murmur as a log shifted. When people speak of influence, Holmes went on, they often imagine persuasion or instruction, but the most lasting influence is repetition. Yes, I said. What is done quietly, again and again? Precisely, Holmes replied. He rose and crossed the room slowly, as though illustrating his point through movement. Consider, he said, the way one closes a door. Some do so firmly, some gently, Over time, those who live together come to mirror one another, and eventually, I said, it feels natural. Holmes nodded. Mr. Latham's case, he continued, is an example of this phenomenon left uninterrupted. He paused near the window. For years, Holmes said, he shared his space with someone whose habits were rooted in care. Those habits did not vanish when she did. No, I said, they remained. And in remaining, Holmes added, they sought expression. The room felt especially still now, as though listening. There is a common belief, Holmes said, that habits belong to individuals. But they belong to relationships, I said. Holmes smiled faintly. Exactly, he said. He returned to his chair. When a relationship ends, he continued, its habits often persist without instruction. They are not aware that the relationship has concluded. I reflected on this quietly. Most people, I said, attempt to break such habits. Yes, Holmes replied, often out of necessity. But Mr. Latham did not, I said. No, Holmes replied. He allowed them to remain. Firelight flickered across the walls, its movement slow and steady, and in allowing them, Holmes continued, he preserved something essential. What was that? I asked. Continuity, Holmes replied. He folded his hands together. Lives, he said, are rarely defined by singular moments. They are defined by repetition. Yes, I said, by what is done daily. And nightly, Holmes added. The clock ticked on, its rhythm familiar and reassuring. There are habits, Holmes said, that fade quickly when circumstances change. And others, I said, that endure. Yes, Holmes replied. The difference lies in whether they are tied to necessity or meaning. I nodded. Mr. Latham's routines, I said, were meaningful. Indeed, Holmes replied. They were acts of shared care. The room felt warmer as the evening deepened. Such habits, Holmes continued, do not belong to one person alone. They belong to the life that was lived. And when that life changes, I said, the habits seek to continue it. Holmes inclined his head. Well put, he said. There was a long pause. Outside, a distant sound drifted briefly through the window before fading again. Do you believe, I asked, that habits can be inherited? Holmes considered. In a sense, he said, but not in the way one inherits objects. How so? I asked. They are inherited through presence, Holmes replied, through proximity and repetition. Yes, I said. One learns without being taught. Exactly, Holmes replied. He rose once more and crossed to the bookcase, adjusting a volume that had shifted slightly. Books, he said, bear the marks of their readers. And rooms, I added, bear the marks of their inhabitants. Holmes smiled. Everything that endures, he said, does so by absorbing what passes through it. The thought settled quietly. There is something comforting, I said, in the idea that habits may outlive us. Yes, Holmes replied, provided they are gentle ones. The fire burned lower still, though the warmth remained. Mr. Latham, Holmes said, has discovered that his habits are not signs of disturbance. No, I said. They are signs of continuity. And in recognizing them as such, Holmes continued, he has removed their power to unsettle. The clock marked another hour. I felt my own thoughts slowing, the day's concerns loosening their hold. This case, I said, has been about preservation. Yes, Holmes replied, but also about permission. Permission to continue? I asked. Permission to remember, Holmes said. He leaned back, his gaze resting upon the fire. There are habits, he said, that deserve to remain. I nodded. And others, Holmes added, that fade naturally when no longer needed. The room seemed to breathe with us, its quiet deep and unforced. I doubt, Holmes said, that Mr. Latham will experience further uncertainty. And if he does, I asked. Then he will recognize it, Holmes replied, not as intrusion, but as echo. The word lingered. Echo, I said. That feels appropriate. Yes, Holmes replied. An echo is not a voice. It is a reminder. The fire settled into embers, glowing softly. There is nothing more to examine, Holmes said, only something to allow. I rose slowly, feeling the evening's calm settle fully. Good night, Holmes, I said. Good night, Watson, he replied. As I withdrew, the sitting room remained behind me, unchanged, attentive, and at rest. And somewhere in Bloomsbury, habits that had outlived their origin continued quietly, no longer as questions, but as affirmations. There is a moment each night when the world loosens its grip. It does not arrive suddenly, nor does it announce itself with certainty. It comes instead as a gradual easing, a softening of edges, a willingness to release what has been held throughout the day. Holmes spoke of this often, though rarely in direct terms. On this particular evening, Baker Street seemed especially attuned to that transition. The fire burned low and steady, offering warmth without insistence. The lamps cast a gentle light that asked nothing of the eyes. Outside, London moved in its own distant rhythm, present but unobtrusive. I had taken my place in the familiar chair, my thoughts already drifting, when Holmes broke the silence. There is a state, he said quietly, in which the mind is most honest. I looked toward him. Sleep? I asked. Not quite, Holmes replied. Nor waking. He rested his hands together, his fingers loosely interlaced. The space between, he continued. The moment when intention relaxes, but awareness has not yet withdrawn. I nodded slowly. I know it, I said. One feels present, but unburdened. Yes, Holmes replied. It is in that state that habits reveal themselves most clearly. The fire murmured softly, then settled again. Mr. Latham's experience, Holmes said, occurred precisely there, in the in-between, I said. Holmes inclined his head. When the mind relinquishes control, he said, the body continues its familiar work, and does so faithfully, I added. Indeed, Holmes replied, without judgment. The room felt especially still now, as though the very air had slowed. Most people, Holmes continued, believe sleep to be an absence. Yes, I said, a suspension. But it's not, Holmes replied. It is a different mode of attention. I considered this, one that does not question, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. The clock ticked on, its rhythm steady and reassuring. In waking life, Holmes said, we analyze, we question, we correct. And in sleep? I asked. In sleep, Holmes replied, we continue. The words settled, gently. Consider the actions Mr. Latham described, Holmes said. They were not creative, they were restorative. Yes, I said. They returned things to familiar positions, because familiarity requires no thought, Holmes replied. It is recognized rather than evaluated. The firelight flickered slowly across the walls. There is comfort, Holmes said, in actions that require no decision. Yes, I agreed. They allow the mind to rest. Holmes leaned back slightly. The in-between state, he continued, is where such actions live. I felt my own awareness soften as he spoke, my breathing slowing without effort. Have you ever, Holmes asked, awoken and felt as though you had been doing something important? Yes, I said, though I could not say what. Holmes smiled faintly. That is the mind acknowledging continuity, he said. And when we cannot remember, I asked, then the body remembers for us, Holmes replied. The clock marked another quarter hour. Mr. Latham did not wander his house as a stranger, Holmes said. He moved through it as someone deeply familiar. Yes, I said, as someone at home. Exactly, Holmes replied. The room seemed to listen, content in its stillness. Sleepwalking, Holmes continued, is often misunderstood. In what way? I asked. It is not the mind leaving the body, Holmes replied. It is the body continuing without instruction. I nodded. And that can be unsettling, I said. Only when misunderstood, Holmes replied. The fire burned lower still, its warmth lingering even as its light dimmed. Mr. Latham's concern, Holmes said, arose when waking logic encountered sleeping continuity. Ed could not reconcile it, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. Until awareness bridged the two, the thought felt important. When understanding enters the in-between, Holmes continued, the action loses its mystery and becomes familiar, I said. Again, Holmes replied. The clock ticked on. There is nothing unnatural, Holmes said, about such states. No, I agreed. They feel quite ordinary, once named. Holmes inclined his head. Most people experience them, he said. Few reflect upon them. The room felt warmer, quieter. Sleep, Holmes said, is not a departure. It is a rearrangement. Yes, I said. The mind steps back, and the body steps forward, Holmes replied. The fire murmured softly, then settled. Mr. Latham's sister, Holmes said, performed her routines without thought, and he absorbed them, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, until they became shared. And now, I said, they persist, because the in-between does not recognize endings, Holmes said. The words drifted gently. There is comfort, Holmes continued, in knowing that such states are not dangerous. Yes, I said, they are gentle and purposeful, Holmes added, even when unnoticed. I felt my eyelids grow heavy, my thoughts less distinct. This room, Holmes said softly, exists in such a state each night. And Baker Street, I added. Yes, Holmes replied. It holds itself quietly, awaiting morning. The clock chimed softly, its sound muted and restrained. There will come night, Holmes said, when Mr. Latham sleeps without interruption. And wakes without question, I said. Holmes smiled faintly. That night may have already arrived, he said. The fire burned low, now mostly embers. There is nothing more to explain, Holmes said gently, only something to allow. For it's very thorough but settle deeply. This chapter of the case, I said, belongs to rest. Yes, Holmes replied. And rest is its own resolution. I rose slowly, careful not to disturb the calm. Good night, Holmes, I said. Good night, Watson, he replied. As I withdrew, the sitting room remained behind me, warm, attentive, and entirely at ease. And somewhere between sleeping and waking, routines continued quietly, not as mysteries, but as assurances. There are resolutions that arrive like doors flung open. They announce themselves with certainty, with declaration, with the unmistakable sense that something has ended and something else must begin. Such resolutions are unmistakable, but they are rarely peaceful. This was not one of those. The resolution of Latham's mystery came not as an event, but as a quiet shift, a subtle realignment of understanding that required no announcement. It arrived, as many important things do, without insisting upon recognition. Holmes and I did not speak of the case for several days, not because it was unfinished, but because it no longer required examination. It had settled into its proper shape, and to disturb it further would have been unnecessary. One evening, as the fire burned low and the lamps cast their familiar glow, Holmes spoke again of Mr. Latham, not with inquiry, but with reflection. "There is a particular relief," he said, "in solving a mystery without naming a culprit." I looked up. "And without discovering a crime," I added. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and without confronting an adversary." Rested his hands loosely upon the arms of his chair. "Fear," he continued, "often arises not from danger, but from misinterpretation." I nodded. "Latham feared intrusion," I said, "but there was none." "No," Holmes replied. "He feared that something within his life had become unrecognizable." The fire murmured softly. "And now?" I asked. "And now," Holmes said, "it has been recognized." The room felt especially calm, as though the very idea of resolution had settled comfortably into it. "Most mysteries," Holmes continued, "are framed in terms of threat." "Yes," I said, "something has been taken, damaged, or altered, and therefore," Holmes said, "the mind prepares for defense." "But this one," I said, "required no defense." "No," Holmes replied, "only understanding." He leaned back slightly. "There is a tendency," he said, "to assume that resolution must involve removal." "Removing a presence," I said, "or stopping a behavior." "Yes," Holmes replied, "but some mysteries resolve through integration." The word lingered. "Integration," I said, "bringing parts together." "Precisely," Holmes replied, "rather than separating them." The clock ticked steadily, its rhythm unbroken. "Mr. Latham's habits," Holmes continued, "were not symptoms to be eliminated." "No," I said, "they were expressions, and once recognized as such," Holmes said, "they ceased to provoke alarm." I reflected on this quietly. "It seems almost too simple," I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Simple," he said, "is often mistaken for insufficient." "Yes," I agreed, "people expect effort and drama," Holmes added. The firelight shifted slowly across the walls. "But the mind," Holmes said, "does not require drama to resolve. It requires coherence." I nodded. "Once the pieces align," I said, "the tension dissolves." "Exactly," Holmes replied. He rose and crossed the room, standing briefly before the window. "There is nothing more unsettling," he said, "than feeling that one's own life has become unfamiliar." "And nothing more reassuring," I said, "than realizing it is not." Holmes inclined his head. "Mr. Latham's fear," he said, "was not of being watched." "No," I said, "it was of having lost himself." "Yes," Holmes replied, "and that fear has now been addressed." The room felt warmer still, though the fire had not changed. "There will be no dramatic conclusion," Holmes said, "no final scene." "And that is appropriate," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "because nothing was ever truly wrong." The clock chimed softly. "I expect," Holmes continued, "that Mr. Latham will continue to live much as before." "And if he adjusts his routines?" I asked. "Then they will adjust gently," Holmes replied, "as habits do when acknowledged." The fire burned low, its glow steady and reassuring. "This mystery," Holmes said, "has been solved without fear and without loss," I added. "Yes," Holmes replied, "which is the rarest kind of solution." I felt a deep sense of ease settle over me. "In your experience," I asked, "how many mysteries truly require fear?" Holmes considered. "Very few," he said, "but many are framed that way." "And the others?" I asked. "They require patience," Holmes replied, and listening. The room fell into silence once more. Outside, London continued its quiet routines, lamps being lit, doors closing softly, footsteps fading into distance. "There are people," Holmes said, "who believe that understanding diminishes mystery." "Yes," I said, "that explanation removes wonder." Holmes smiled faintly. "I believe the opposite," he said. "Understanding allows mystery to rest." The thought settled gently. "When fear is removed," Holmes continued, "what remains is meaning." I nodded. "And meaning," I said, "is far more enduring." The clock ticked on. "This case," Holmes said, "has required no record beyond this." "No publication?" I asked, smiling. "No," Holmes replied. "It belongs to the quiet category." I smiled in return. "And yet," I said, "it has been instructive." "Yes," Holmes replied, "in the ways that matter." The fire dimmed further, now mostly embers. "There is nothing left to explain," Holmes said softly. "No," I agreed. We sat together in silence, the case fully at rest. Somewhere in Bloomsbury, I imagined a narrow house standing quietly, its rooms no longer holding their breath, its routines continuing without question. The mystery had not been defeated. It had been understood, and that, I thought, was the most peaceful resolution of all. There is a peculiar quiet that follows understanding. It is not the silence that comes after noise, nor the stillness that follows effort. It is a quieter thing still, a sense that nothing further needs to be done, and that what remains may simply be allowed to remain. This was the quiet that settled over Baker Street in the days following the resolution of Mr. Latham's concerns. Holmes did not speak of the matter again directly. He did not refer to it as a case, nor did he set aside notes or observations, as he sometimes did when an affair had concluded. Instead, he allowed it to dissolve naturally into the rhythm of our days, as though it had always belonged there. I noticed the change, not through absence, but through ease. Meals were taken without hurry, reading resumed without interruption. Even Holmes's violin appeared less frequently in his hands, not because he lacked inclination, but because silence now felt sufficient. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the windows and the fire murmured low, I remarked upon it. "You seem content," I said. Holmes looked up from his book. "Contentment," he replied, "is merely understanding without urgency." I considered this, and urgency, I said, is alarm without clarity. Holmes smiled faintly. "Well observed," he said. The rain continued its steady rhythm, neither heavy nor insistent. The sound blended easily with the ticking of the clock, forming a quiet pattern that required no attention. "Mr. and Latham's experience," Holmes said after a time, "illustrates principle often overlooked." "In what way?" I asked. "That alarm is not response to danger," Holmes replied. "It is a response to uncertainty." I nodded. "And when uncertainty is resolved," I said, "alarm no longer serves purpose." "Exactly," Holmes replied. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed. "Many people," he continued, "mistake alarm for instinct." "Yes," I said. "They assume it is protective, and sometimes it is," Holmes replied, "but often it is merely habitual." The fire shifted softly, then settled again. "In Mr. Latham's case," Holmes said, "alarm arose because his conscious understanding had fallen behind his lived experience. He was acting without explanation." I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and explanation restores coherence." The word felt appropriate. "Coherence," I said. "Things fitting together." Holmes nodded. "When events align with understanding," he said, "the mind rests." The room felt particularly restful at that moment, as though the concept itself had been absorbed by the walls. "There is a tendency," Holmes continued, "to respond to the unfamiliar with defense." "Yes," I said, "to assume threat." But the unfamiliar, Holmes said, is not always new. Sometimes it is simply unnoticed. I reflected on this quietly. Mr. Latham's habits, I said, were familiar to him once. Yes, Holmes replied, so familiar that he ceased to see them. And when they reappeared, I said, they seemed foreign. Precisely, Holmes replied. The clock marked another hour, its sound gentle and unremarkable. Understanding, Holmes said, is the act of restoring familiarity, and alarm, I said, is what occurs when familiarity is lost. Holmes smiled. You see the symmetry, he said. We fell into a comfortable silence. Outside, the rain softened, then ceased entirely, leaving the street below washed and quiet. A carriage passed at a distance, its sound brief and unobtrusive. There is something else, Holmes said after a while. Yes? I asked. Understanding, he said, does not require certainty about the future. I considered this. No, I said, only clarity about the present. Exactly, Holmes replied. He rose and crossed the room slowly, pausing by the window. Mr. Latham does not need to predict whether his habits will continue, Holmes said. He needs only to recognize them. And recognition, I said, changes their character. Yes, Holmes replied, from threat to expression. The firelight flickered gently across the room. Many people, Holmes continued, live in quiet alarm without realizing it. Yes, I said. They adjust constantly, without understanding why, and such adjustment, Holmes said, is exhausting. I nodded. To live without alarm, I said, must feel like relief. It does, Holmes replied. But it often requires explanation to arrive there. The room felt warmer still, though the fire had not changed. This case, Holmes said, has reminded me of something essential. What is that? I asked. That not all solutions involve action, he replied. Some involve allowing what already exists to be seen. I smiled faintly. That seems fitting, I said. Holmes returned to his chair. There will be no further developments, he said. Nothing more to anticipate. And that, I said, is itself reassuring. Yes, Holmes replied. The clock ticked on. I felt my thoughts slowing, the edges of the day softening. Understanding instead of alarm, Holmes said quietly, is a kind of rest. Yes, I agreed, a deep one. He inclined his head. And rest, he said, is sometimes the truest conclusion. We sat together as evening settled, the room holding its familiar shape, the world beyond, moving gently along. Somewhere in Bloomsbury, a narrow house continued its quiet routines, no longer puzzling, no longer questioned, not because anything had changed, but because it had been understood. It was Mr. Latham who suggested it. His second letter arrived some days later, carried by the same unassuming postman and written in the same careful hand. There was no sense of urgency in it, only deliberation, each word placed with the same consideration that characterized his manner of living. Holmes read it in silence, then passed it to me. My dear Mr. Holmes, I hope you will forgive the familiarity of my request. I do not write from concern, but from inclination. There is something I find myself wishing to do, and I believe it would be right to do it consciously, rather than by habit alone. The letter continued. Latham explained that he had found himself standing before the clock one evening, his hand resting upon its winding key. He had not wound it. He had not stopped himself either. Instead, he had paused, aware, for the first time, of the moment itself. I realized, he wrote, that the decision mattered less than the awareness. Holmes smiled faintly as I finished reading. Yes, he said, that is precisely where meaning resides. Mr. Latham's letter concluded with a simple invitation. If it would not trouble you, I should like you both to visit once more. not to investigate, but to witness. Holmes rose almost at once. "I believe," he said, "that we should accept." We returned to Bloomsbury that evening as daylight faded. The street was much as it always had been, narrow, orderly, and quietly receptive. The houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows glowing softly as lamps were lit within. Nothing announced our arrival. Nothing resisted it. Mr. Latham greeted us at the door with a warmth that was unforced and unguarded. "I am glad you came," he said. "As are we," Holmes replied. Inside, the house felt subtly different, not rearranged, but settled. The air itself seemed calmer, as though it had relinquished some small vigilance. We moved into the sitting room. The clock still stood above the mantel, its face clean and dignified, its hands motionless. A fire burned low in the grate, tended but unassuming. Mr. Latham gestured toward the chairs, and we sat. "For many years," he said, "this room followed a rhythm I did not question." Holmes nodded. "And now?" he asked. "And now," Mr. Latham replied, "I wish to acknowledge it." He rose slowly and crossed the mantel. "I do not know," he said, "whether I wish the clock to speak again." Holmes remained seated, his expression calm. "You need not decide yet," he said. "The act of standing here is already sufficient." Mr. Latham smiled. "That is what I thought," he said. He rested his hand upon the clock's winding key, then let it fall away. "For a long time," he said quietly, "this action belonged to another." "And now?" Holmes asked. "And now," Mr. Latham replied, "belongs to the moment." There was no tension in the room, only attention. After a pause, Mr. Latham turned toward Holmes. "I wondered," he said, "whether you would stand with me." Holmes rose at once and joined him before the mantel. They stood side by side, neither imposing nor instructing. Holmes did not reach for the clock. He did not gesture or speak. His presence was enough. I watched from my chair, struck by the simplicity of it all. Mr. Latham lifted his hand again. "This time," he said, "I will wind it." He turned the key slowly, deliberately. There was no hurry in the motion, no attempt to complete it quickly. Each turn was made with awareness, as though marking something rather than initiating it. At last, the mechanism caught. The clock spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, only a soft, steady tick, a sound so gentle it seemed to blend immediately with the room itself. Mr. Latham exhaled. "It sounds," he said, "just as it did." "Yes," Holmes replied, "and yet not the same." Mr. Latham smiled. "No," he agreed, "because now I am here for it." They returned to their seats. The clock continued its quiet work, marking time without insistence. "I did not do this," Mr. Latham said, "to restore the past." "No," Holmes replied, "you did it to acknowledge it." Latham nodded. "For many years," he said, "the sound of that clock meant that the day was complete." "And now?" Holmes asked. "Now," Mr. Latham said, "it means that the moment is chosen." The room seemed to accept this without question. We remained there for some time, speaking little. The clock's gentle rhythm filled the spaces between our thoughts, neither intrusive nor demanding. At last, Mr. Latham spoke again. "I do not know," he said, "whether I will wind it every night." Holmes smiled faintly. "You need not," he said. "Its purpose has already been served." Latham inclined his head. "Yes," he said, "I think I understand that now." When we took our leave, the house felt entirely at rest. Outside, the street received us quietly, the evening deepening around us. As we walked back toward Baker Street, I spoke. "That moment," I said, "felt significant." "Yes," Holmes replied. But not because of the clock. No, I said, because of the choice. Holmes inclined his head. Symbols, he said, are most powerful when they are simple. The city moved gently around us, its sounds softened by distance. Behind us, in a narrow Bloomsbury house, a clock kept time once more, not as a reminder of what had been lost, as a quiet companion to what remained. The visit had not been planned. That, perhaps, was what made it fitting. Several evenings after the clock had been wound in Bloomsbury, Holmes suggested, almost as an aside, that we take a walk before night fully claimed the city. There was no mention of destination, no indication that anything required attention, only the sense that dusk was approaching and that it might be met rather than waited for. We left Baker Street as the light softened, the sky transitioning through its familiar gradations. The day had not been remarkable, nor had it needed to be. The air was mild, the streets active but unhurried, and London appeared content to conduct itself without drama. Holmes walked beside me with his usual measured pace, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He did not speak at first, and I did not press him to. Some conversations, I had learned, began best when allowed to form themselves. It was only after several minutes that he spoke. There are moments, he said, when one returns not to confirm, but to release. I considered this. To release what? I asked. Expectation, Holmes replied. We turned into Bloomsbury without remark. The district was already beginning to quiet. Shops prepared to close, and lamps were being lighted one by one, each pool of light forming gently upon the pavement. A familiar narrow street appeared ahead of us, unchanged in appearance, yet subtly altered in feeling. We stopped across from Mr. Latham's house. The windows glowed softly, curtains drawn just enough to suggest warmth. Within, the street itself was empty, not from abandonment, but from rest. Holmes did not approach the door. Instead, we stood where we were, content to observe without intruding. There is no need, he said quietly, as though responding to an unspoken question. No, I agreed. It feels complete. We remained there as dusk deepened. The sky shifted from pale gray to a muted blue, and the last light of day receded without ceremony. A distant sound, perhaps a cart or a closing door, drifted briefly through the air, then vanished. Through the window we could see Mr. Latham seated by the fire. He held a book, though whether he read or merely rested with it, I could not tell. His posture was relaxed, his movements unhurried. There was no searching glance toward the room, no sense of vigilance. Above the mantel, the clock marked time quietly. It did not dominate the room. It did not call attention to itself. It simply existed, as clocks are meant to do. Holmes watched for some time without speaking. He is not waiting, he said at last. No, I replied. He is present. Holmes nodded. That, he said, is the difference. We stepped away from the window and continued down the street, walking slowly, without purpose beyond the act itself. There are cases, Holmes said, that conclude when the mystery is solved. And others? I asked. That conclude when the mystery is no longer needed, he replied. We reached the end of the street and paused. The trees along the avenue stood still, their branches outlined against the darkening sky. The lamps cast a steady, unchanging light, and the city beyond seemed to hold itself quietly. Mr. Latham's life, Holmes said, was never disrupted. No, I said, only misunderstood. Yes, Holmes replied, and misunderstanding, when left unattended, has a way of magnifying itself. We turned back towards Baker Street. our pace unhurried. As we walked, Holmes spoke of small things, of the way dusk alters perception, of how familiar streets seem narrower at night, of how the mind often fills silence with expectation when none is required. None of it demanded response. It was enough to listen. By the time we reached home, night had fully arrived. The sitting room welcomed us with its familiar warmth. Hudson had lighted the lamps, and the fire burned low, its embers glowing steadily. The room felt unchanged, and yet, like Mr. Latham's house, it felt settled. Holmes removed his coat and paused briefly, as though considering whether to speak. "Evan," he said, "that was our final visit." "Yes," I said, though nothing ended. Holmes smiled faintly. "Exactly," he said. We took our seats. The clock upon our mantel ticked gently, its sound blending easily with the quiet of the room. "There is a temptation," Holmes said, "to mark endings with significance." "Yes," I replied, "to define them. And yet," Holmes continued, "the most lasting conclusions are often unmarked." I reflected on this as the fire murmured softly. "Mr. Latham's case," Holmes said, "did not require a closing statement." "No," I said, "it required acknowledgement." "And acknowledgement," Holmes replied, "has already occurred." The room fell into silence once more. Outside, London moved gently through its night routines. Somewhere nearby, a door closed softly. Somewhere farther off, footsteps faded into distance. "This hour," Holmes said, "is often overlooked." "The hour between day and night," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "the hour of settling." The clock chimed quietly. "There are lives," Holmes continued, "that unfold entirely within such hours. And such lives," I said, "are rarely noticed." Holmes nodded. "But they are not lesser for it," he said, "only quieter." The fire burned lower still, its warmth lingering. I felt a sense of ease settle over me, not the relief of tension released, but the deeper comfort of alignment restored. "This case," I said, "has felt different from the beginning." "Yes," Holmes replied, "because it never saw tension." "And now?" I asked. "And now," Holmes said, "it no longer requires even observation." He leaned back, his gaze unfocused. "There will be no further letters," he said, "no reason for return." "And Mr. Latham?" I asked. "He will continue," Holmes replied, "which is all any of us do." The clock ticked on. I realized then that this story, if it could be called that, had never truly been about Mr. Latham alone. It had been about rooms and routines and the way time settles into the lives we build. About how understanding can arrive, not as revelation, but as permission. Holmes rose at last and crossed to the window, parting the curtains slightly. The street lay quiet, the lamps steady, the night fully formed. "It is enough," he said softly. "Yes," I agreed. He returned to his chair and reached for his violin, not to play, but to rest his hand upon it, acknowledging its presence. "Some evenings," he said, "require no sound at all." The fire dimmed further. The clock continued its gentle work, and somewhere in Bloomsbury, a narrow house stood quietly at dusk's far edge, its rooms no longer waiting, its routines no longer questioned. The visit had been final not because it marked an end, but because nothing more was required. There are nights when Baker Street seems to withdraw, not from the city, nor from the world beyond its doors, but from urgency. On such nights, the street does not sleep so much as it settles, its familiar sounds softening, its presence becoming less insistent, as though it were content to exist without being observed. This was such a night. Within the sitting room at 201B, the fire had been reduced to a quiet bed of embers. Its warmth lingered, held by the walls and furniture, asking nothing further of flame. The lamps cast their accustomed glow, steady and reassuring. Illuminating the room without emphasis, Holmes sat in his chair by the hearth, his posture relaxed, his long frame at ease. There was no book in his hands, no violin resting nearby. He appeared not to be engaged in thought, so much as allowing thought to pass through him unremarked. I sat opposite, my own attention drifting easily, unanchored by any particular concern. The clock ticked on. It was a sound so familiar that it scarcely registered, and yet it shaped the room as surely as the walls themselves. Time moved forward without demand, without urgency, its passage acknowledged, but not examined. This, Holmes said quietly, is how a room should feel. I looked toward him. At rest? I asked. At peace, he replied. There is a difference. I considered this as the fire murmured faintly. Rest, Holmes continued, implies recovery from exertion. And peace? I asked. Peace, Holmes replied, implies alignment. The word settled gently. Baker Street, he said, is aligned this evening. I glanced about the room. Nothing appeared unusual. The chairs stood where they always had. The books remained neatly arranged. The violin rested in its place, untouched, but acknowledged. And yet, Holmes was right. There was no sense of anticipation, no expectation of interruption. The room did not wait for anything. It simply existed, complete within itself. Do you recall, Holmes asked, how often this room has held itself in readiness? Yes, I said, waiting for the knock at the door. Precisely, Holmes replied. Waiting is a form of tension. And tonight? I asked. Tonight, Holmes said, there is nothing to wait for. The clock marked another quarter hour. Outside, the street responded faintly. A distant carriage, a soft closing door, footsteps passing without pause. None of it intruded. Each sound arrived, lingered briefly, then receded. The conclusion of a case, Holmes said, it's often marked by activity. Yes, I replied. Paperwork, correspondence, and reflection, Holmes added. Yes, I said. But occasionally, Holmes continued, a case concludes by returning the room to itself. I nodded slowly. This case, I said, never truly occupied the room. No, Holmes replied. It passed through it. The fire dimmed further, its glow now little more than suggestion. There is a temptation, Holmes said, to measure significance by disruption. Yes, I agreed. We remember what disturbs us. And yet, Holmes continued, the most meaningful moments are often those that restore. The clock ticked on. I have spent many evenings, Holmes said, attempting to impose order upon chaos. And this time, I asked. This time, he replied, order revealed itself, without intervention. The room felt especially quiet now, as though acknowledging the truth of his words. Mr. Latham's house, Holmes continued, has found its rhythm again. Yes, I said, and Baker Street mirrors it. Holmes smiled faintly. Rooms speak to one another, he said, not through sound, but through alignment. I found the idea comforting. The sitting room, Holmes said, has been attentive for many days. And now? I asked. And now, he replied, it rests. I felt my own thoughts follow suit, slowing, loosening their hold. Watson, Holmes said, do you know why so many cases exhaust Holmes pursue them? Because of danger? I suggested. No, Holmes replied, because of vigilance. I considered this. To remain alert, I said, is tiring. Yes, Holmes replied, even when nothing occurs. The clock chimed softly. marking the hour. Vigilance, Holmes continued, has its place, but it must be relinquished when no longer required. And this evening, I said, it is no longer required. Was it Peter? Holmes replied. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, not in sleep, but in release. There are nights, he said, when the mind insists upon activity, and others, I said, when it permits rest. Holmes inclined his head. This is the latter. The room seemed to breathe with us, its quiet deep and unforced. I became aware of the subtle details, the way the light fell upon the rug, the faint scent of extinguished flame, the gentle regularity of the clock. Everything was as it should be. Baker Street, Holmes said, has been many things to many people. Yes, I said, a place of inquiry, of urgency. And occasionally, Holmes added, a place of repose. The word lingered pleasantly. Tonight, Holmes said, it is precisely that. The fire offered one last soft crackle, then settled completely. Outside, the street grew quieter still. There will be no knock tonight, Holmes said calmly. No, I agreed. And if there were, he asked. Then we would answer, I said, but without haste. Holmes smiled faintly. That is peace, he said. The clock ticked on. I felt the evening's calm deepen, the edges of thought softening. This room, Holmes said, does not anticipate tomorrow. No, I said. It trusts it will arrive. Holmes inclined his head. Trust, he said, is the final stage of rest. The sitting room held itself gently, no longer attentive, no longer vigilant, just present. And as Baker Street settled fully into its quiet, I realized that the story itself was preparing to do the same, loosening its hold, releasing its final threads. Nothing more needed to be added. Nothing more needed to be done. There comes a moment when attention is set aside. It is not the same as distraction, nor is it forgetfulness. It is simply the recognition that nothing further requires vigilance, that all which needed to be noticed has already been received. This moment arrived at Baker Street without announcement. The night was neither remarkable nor unusual. It carried no particular distinction, and yet it possessed a completeness that needed no explanation. The lamps burned steadily. The fire rested in its embers. The room held its shape without effort. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, his posture relaxed, his presence unassertive. He did not read. He did not play. He did not appear to think in an ill-structured way. Rather, he allowed the evening to pass through him, unexamined and unopposed. I sat nearby, aware of my own breathing, aware of the gentle continuity of the room. The clock ticked on. Once, that sound might have signaled readiness, an invitation to prepare, to listen, to wait. Tonight, it signaled nothing more than time continuing as it always had. There is a point, Holmes said quietly, at which listening becomes unnecessary. I looked toward him. Because nothing is hidden? I asked. No, he replied, because nothing is expected. The distinction felt important. To listen, Holmes continued, is often to anticipate. Yes, I said, to prepare for interruption. And when interruption is no longer anticipated, he said, listening may rest. The room seemed to accept this naturally, as though it had been waiting for permission to do so. Outside, London moved softly through the night. Distant sounds arrived and departed without insistence. A carriage passed, a door closed, footsteps faded. None of it required attention. This house, Holmes said, has known many states. Yes, I replied, urgency, focus, vigilance, and now. Holmes asked, and now, I said, it is simply itself. Holmes smiled faintly. That, he said, is its truest condition. The fire gave a soft sigh as a final ember settled, releasing its warmth without flame. There's a misconception, Holmes said. The quiet is empty. Yes, I agreed. People often fear it. But quiet, Holmes continued, is not absence. It is sufficiency. The word lingered. Sufficiency, I repeated. When nothing further is required, Holmes said, when all elements are in place. The clock marked another hour. I felt no inclination to mark it myself. Time had ceased to feel like something to observe. There was a time, Holmes said, when I listened constantly. For danger? I asked. For meaning, he replied. I believed it announced itself. And now? I asked. And now, Holmes said, I understand that meaning often arrives when one stops listening for it. The room remained still, receptive, but unengaged. Mr. Latham's house, Holmes continued, reached this state some evenings ago. Yes, I said. It no longer waits. No, Holmes replied. It inhabits itself. The clock ticked gently. And Baker Street? I asked. Holmes considered. Baker Street, he said, has done the same. I looked around the room one last time. There was nothing new to notice. Nothing had shifted. Nothing had altered its position or character. And yet, the room felt complete in a way that did not require description. Do you ever miss, I asked, the moment before a case begins? Holmes smiled faintly. Occasionally, he said, but only when it is present. And when it is not, I asked. Then it is unnecessary, he replied. The thought felt deeply restful. There are endings, Holmes said, that close a door. Yes, I said. And others, he continued, that simply leave it open. This, I said, is the latter. Holmes inclined his head. The best kind, he said. The clock ticked on. I became aware then that my own attention had softened completely. Thoughts arose without urgency and drifted away without effort. The room no longer held me alert. It held me gently. There is nothing left to listen for, Holmes said softly. No, I agreed. And that, he continued, is not a loss. No, I said. It is a release. Outside, the city continued as it always had, unaware of conclusions or completions. Somewhere, a narrow house in Bloomsbury rested in its routines, no longer examined, no longer questioned. Somewhere else, another evening prepared to pass unnoticed. The fire rested. The clock continued. The room breathed, and in that quiet, with nothing left to listen for, the world carried on, steady, sufficient, and at ease.